The city of Neo Haven stretched endlessly into the horizon, its towering skyscrapers piercing the smoggy skies like jagged teeth. Neon lights flickered on every corner, casting colorful glows over crowded streets, filled with people rushing to get somewhere, or nowhere at all. It was a place where technology promised progress but delivered chaos. In this world of noise and clutter, Dr. Ilara Voss tried her best to stay invisible. Ilara was not an ordinary woman. She was a scientist, one of the brightest minds in neurology. Her work focused on repairing damaged brains, helping those who had lost parts of themselves to injury or illness. But despite her brilliance, she lived a quiet life. Every day, she left her small apartment before sunrise, walked through narrow alleys to avoid the crowds, and spent hours locked away in her lab. At night, she returned home just as silently, carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. That particular evening, however, everything changed. It had been raining heavily since morning, turning the streets slick and shiny under the dim glow of streetlights. Ilara pulled her coat tighter around herself as she hurried along the edge of the pavement. The air smelled damp and metallic, mixed with the faint scent of burning fuel from nearby factories. She didn't notice anything unusual until she heard it, a low groan, almost drowned out by the patter of raindrops. Stopping abruptly, Ilara turned toward the sound. There, crumpled against the wall of a dark alley, lay a man. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and blood pooled beneath him. For a moment, she froze. Helping strangers wasn't safe in Neo Haven. Everyone knew that. People disappeared for less than stopping to ask questions. Yet something about the sight of him tugged at her heart. He looked so broken, so helpless. "Are you alive?" she whispered, stepping closer cautiously. The man stirred weakly, his eyes fluttering open for a brief second before closing again. That tiny movement decided it for her. She couldn't leave him there. Not when she could help. Ilara glanced around nervously. The alley was deserted except for a few stray cats darting between trash bins. Still, she knew time was critical. Bending down, she slipped one arm under his shoulder and hoisted him up as gently as she could. He groaned softly, but didn't resist. Together, they staggered out of the alley and toward her vehicle parked a block away. Her car, an old beat-up hovercraft, was far from luxurious, but it served its purpose. With great effort, she managed to drag the man inside and buckle him into the passenger seat. Then, gripping the steering wheel tightly, she sped off into the rainy night. Back at her underground clinic, a hidden space beneath her apartment building, Ilara got to work. She cleaned his wounds carefully, stitching up cuts and applying antiseptic gel to prevent infection. As she worked, she studied his face. He was younger than she'd first thought, probably in his early 30s. His features were sharp, his jawline strong. But there was also a weariness etched into his skin, as though he carried burdens heavier than most. When he finally woke up hours later, Ilara was sitting beside him, sipping a cup of lukewarm tea. He blinked several times, disoriented, then tried to sit up too quickly. She placed a firm hand on his chest to stop him. "Take it easy," she said softly. "You're safe here for now." "Where am I?" he croaked, his voice rough. "My clinic," she replied. "You were hurt pretty badly. I patched you up as much as I could." He stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust her. Finally, he nodded slightly. "Thank you." "I'm Ilara," she said after a pause. "What's your name?" "Kale," he murmured. "Kale Arden." Over the next few days, Kale slowly regained his strength. Ilara learned bits and pieces about him during their conversations. He was a former soldier, once loyal to the ruling corporation, Nexora Corp. But something had happened, something big enough to turn him into a fugitive. Now he was on the run, hunted by Nexora's enforcers for reasons he wouldn't fully explain. "You shouldn't have helped me," Kale said one evening as they shared a meal of plain rice and canned vegetables. "They'll come looking for me. And if they find me here—" "They won't," Ilara interrupted firmly. "This place is hidden. No one knows about it except me." Kale shook his head. "You don't understand. These people, they don't give up. They'll tear this city apart brick by brick if they have to." Ilara set her spoon down and looked at him squarely. "I couldn't just leave you there to die. What kind of person would that make me?" "A smart one," Kale muttered, but there was no anger in his tone, only sadness. Despite his warnings, Ilara refused to let fear dictate her actions. Over time, they grew closer. Kale shared stories of his past, the battles he fought, the friends he'd lost. And Ilara found herself opening up too. She told him about her frustrations with Nexora Corp, how their greed stifled innovation and crushed hope. Though their worlds seemed miles apart, they discovered a shared desire to see change. But peace never lasts long in Neo Haven. One night, as Ilara slept in her tiny bedroom above the clinic, a loud crash jolted her awake. Heart pounding, she grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs. The door to the clinic had been forced open, and shadows moved inside. Kale stood in the center of the room, holding a makeshift weapon, a piece of metal pipe in his hands. "They're here," he said grimly. Ilara's mind raced. "How did they find us?" "I don't know. But we need to move. Now." Together, they slipped out through a hidden exit behind a false wall. The tunnels beyond were dark and narrow, twisting like veins beneath the city. Kel led the way, guiding them deeper into the labyrinth until the sounds of pursuit faded away. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, Ilara leaned against the cold stone wall, trembling. "What happens now?" she asked. Kel hesitated, then reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You saved my life, Ilara. I won't forget that. Someday I'll repay you." And with that promise, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving her alone, but forever changed. Years passed, but the memory of Kale lingered in Ilara's mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. Life in Neo Haven had only grown worse since that fateful night. The city was now a bleak landscape of crumbling dreams and suffocating control. Nexera Corp ruled with an iron fist, its influence reaching every corner of society. People lived under constant surveillance, their movements tracked by drones buzzing overhead and cameras hidden in plain sight. Freedom was a word whispered in secret, if at all. Ilara tried to focus on her work, pouring herself into research aimed at helping others. Her lab became both her sanctuary and her prison, a place where she could forget the chaos outside, even if only for a little while. But no matter how hard she worked, the world around her kept pulling her back to reality. Crime rates soared as desperation spread. Families were torn apart by poverty or vanished without a trace after crossing Nexora's enforcers. It felt like the entire city was drowning, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Despite the danger, Ilara refused to stay silent. She began speaking out against Nexora Corp whenever she had the chance, first through small protests, then online forums, and eventually in public speeches at underground gatherings. Her voice resonated with many who felt powerless, earning her both admiration and enemies. Some called her brave, others foolish. To Ilara, it didn't matter. What mattered was making people realize they weren't alone, that someone still believed in fighting for a better future. But standing up to Nexora came at a cost. Threats arrived regularly, anonymous messages left on her doorstep, warning her to stop meddling. Once, someone broke into her apartment and smashed her equipment, leaving behind a single note, "This is your last warning." Yet Ilara refused to back down. If anything, the threats made her more determined. Meanwhile, far from Neo Haven, Cal Arden had become a legend among rebel groups scattered across the galaxy. Stories of his daring escapes, strategic brilliance, and unyielding determination inspired countless fighters. He led raids on Nexra facilities, sabotaged supply lines, and exposed the corporation's darkest secrets to the public. Each victory brought hope to those oppressed by Nexra's tyranny, but also increased the bounty on his head. Yet, despite his outward success, Kale carried a heavy burden. The faces of lost comrades haunted his dreams, and guilt gnawed at him during quiet moments. Most of all, he thought about Ilara, the woman who had risked everything to save him when no one else would. Her kindness had stayed with him, a beacon of light in the darkness. He often wondered if she was safe, if she ever thought about him too. But he dared not contact her. Doing so might put her in even greater danger than before. Then one day, Kel received intel that changed everything. While hacking into Nexora's secure network, he stumbled upon classified files detailing a horrifying new project. Codenamed Erebus, it involved creating a device capable of controlling minds on a massive scale. Once activated, Erebus could erase free will, turning entire populations into obedient puppets. Worse yet, buried within the documents was a list of scientists forced to collaborate on the project. And near the top of that list was Ilara Voss. Cal's blood ran cold. He knew what this meant. Nexera wasn't just threatening Ilara. They were using her skills to build a weapon that could destroy humanity's last shred of freedom. And once they were done with her, well, Cal didn't want to think about what might happen next. For days, he wrestled with indecision. Returning to Neo Haven would be suicide. The city was crawling with Nexra enforcers, and his face was plastered on wanted posters everywhere. But staying away wasn't an option either. Ilara had saved his life once. Now it was his turn to repay the favor. With grim resolve, Kel gathered his team and prepared for a mission unlike any other. This wasn't just about taking down Nexora. It was personal. Back in Neo Haven, Ilara's life had become a nightmare. After being abducted by Nextra agents, she'd been forced to work on Erebus under threat of execution. They promised her family and friends would suffer if she resisted, leaving her with no choice but to comply. Day after day, she sat in a sterile lab surrounded by machines and monitors, pretending to follow orders while secretly searching for ways to sabotage the project. It was exhausting work, not just physically, but emotionally. Every line of code she wrote felt like a betrayal of her principles. Every breakthrough brought her closer to completing the very thing she feared most. Yet, amidst the despair, a spark of defiance remained. She deleted critical data, introduced subtle errors into the programming, and delayed progress whenever possible. It wasn't much, but it gave her a sense of purpose. Still, the strain was taking its toll. Sleep eluded her, and her hands trembled constantly. She avoided looking in mirrors, afraid of seeing the hollow shell she'd become. Sometimes, late at night, she allowed herself to think about Kale. Was he still alive? Had he found peace somewhere far from here? Or had Nexora finally caught up with him? She never imagined that help was already on the way. As Cal approached Neo Haven, memories flooded back. The narrow alleys, the flickering neon lights, the rain-soaked streets. He remembered the fear and adrenaline of escaping those tunnels years ago, clutching Ilara's promise close to his heart. This time, however, he wasn't running. He was coming back to fight, for justice, for freedom, and for the woman who had given him a second chance. Disguised as one of Nexora's elite enforcers, Kel infiltrated the corporation's headquarters. His mission was clear: locate Ilara, extract her, and destroy Erebus before it could be unleashed. Failure wasn't an option. Inside the building, tension crackled in the air. Armed guards patrolled the corridors, and security checkpoints were everywhere. Kel moved cautiously, blending seamlessly into the crowd of uniformed personnel. With each step, he drew closer to the high-security lab where Ilara was being held. When he finally reached the door, his pulse quickened. Peering through the small window, he saw her sitting at a desk, her head bowed over a keyboard. She looked thinner, paler, but unmistakably alive. For a moment, Kel simply stood there, overwhelmed by relief and anger. Then, steeling himself, he entered the room. Ilara glanced up at the sound of the door opening, expecting another guard or supervisor. Instead, she froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Kale," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's me," he said softly, closing the distance between them. "I'm here to get you out." Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at him, unable to believe he was real. "You came back." "I promised I would," he replied, his tone firm but gentle. "Now let's go." Outside, alarms blared as Kale and Ilara fought their way through waves of enforcers. Bullets whizzed past, glass shattered, and chaos erupted around them. But together, they pushed forward, driven by a shared determination to survive, and to ensure that Nexora's plans would never come to fruition. The high-security lab was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of machines and the rhythmic tapping of keys as Ilara worked. Her mind raced with calculations and sabotage tactics, but her heart felt heavy with despair. Every day under Nexora's control felt like a piece of her soul was being stripped away. She tried to focus on the small victories, introducing glitches into the system, delaying progress. But it wasn't enough. The project, codenamed Erebus, loomed over her like a storm cloud ready to unleash its fury. When the door slid open with a hiss, she didn't look up immediately. Guards often entered unannounced, barking orders or demanding updates. But this time, something felt different. The room seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, she raised her head and froze. Standing in the doorway was Kale Arden. For a moment, neither of them moved. Time itself seemed to pause. Ilara blinked, certain her exhausted mind was playing tricks on her. But there he was, tall and strong, dressed in the uniform of a Nexora enforcer. His face was harder than she remembered, lined with years of struggle and sacrifice, but his eyes were the same, burning with determination and something else. Relief? Guilt? She couldn't tell. "Kale," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's me," he said softly, stepping closer. "I'm here to get you out." Ilara's legs trembled beneath her, threatening to give way. She gripped the edge of the desk for support, staring at him as if he might vanish at any second. You came back. I promised I would, he replied, his tone steady but laced with emotion. Now let's go. Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. Kale's expression hardened instantly. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the door. We don't have much time. Their escape was a blur of adrenaline and danger. Kale led the way, navigating the labyrinthine corridors of Nexora's headquarters with practiced precision. Ilara followed closely, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Part of her wanted to pinch herself to confirm this wasn't some cruel dream conjured by her weary brain. But the cold steel walls, the distant shouts of guards, and Kale's firm grip on her arm were all too real. They reached a stairwell and descended quickly, their footsteps echoing loudly despite their efforts to stay silent. At one point, they nearly collided with a group of enforcers. Kale reacted instinctively, shoving Ilara behind a corner while drawing a concealed weapon. A brief firefight erupted, the sharp crack of gunfire filling the narrow space. Ilara pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding wildly as flashes of light illuminated Kale's determined face. When the coast was clear, Kale motioned for her to keep moving. Stay close, he urged, his voice low but urgent. Finally, they reached the lower levels of the building, where maintenance tunnels branched off like veins beneath the city. Kale punched a code into a keypad, and a hidden door slid open with a soft groan. They slipped inside, plunging into darkness. The air grew cooler, damp, and tinged with the smell of rust and decay. As they navigated the twisting tunnels, Ilara found herself stealing glances at Kale. He moved with purpose, his every step deliberate, yet there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. She wanted to ask him questions, so many questions, but the urgency of their situation kept her silent. Eventually, they stopped in a small alcove to catch their breath. Ilara leaned against the damp wall, her chest rising and falling rapidly. How did you find me? She asked finally, breaking the silence. Cal hesitated, then crouched beside her. I hacked into Nexora's network. I saw your name on a list of scientists working on Erebus. I knew I had to come back. You shouldn't have risked it, she said, shaking her head. This place is crawling with enforcers. You could have been caught, or worse. And leave you here. Kale's voice softened, but there was an edge of frustration. Ilara, you saved my life once. Do you think I'd abandon you now? Her gaze dropped to the ground, unable to meet his intense stare. I thought you were dead. After all these years. I almost was, he admitted quietly. But I never forgot about you. About what you did for me. That night changed everything. A lump formed in Ilara's throat. She wanted to say something, to thank him, to apologize for doubting him, but words failed her. Instead, she simply nodded, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. We're not safe yet, Kale reminded her gently, standing up. We need to keep moving. The journey through the tunnels was grueling. Water dripped from the ceiling, pooling in uneven patches on the floor. Rats scurried past, their tiny claws scratching against the concrete. The only light came from Kale's handheld device, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, Ilara felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, she wasn't alone. At one point, Kale slowed down, allowing Ilara to walk beside him. Tell me what happened, he said. How did they find you? She sighed, rubbing her temples. It was stupid, really. I got careless. I spoke out too loudly during one of those underground meetings. Someone must have reported me. Next thing I knew, they dragged me here and forced me to work on Erebus. They threatened your family. Yes, my sister and her kids. Her voice cracked. I couldn't take the risk. You did what you had to do, Kale assured her. And you've been fighting back in your own way. That counts for something. Ilara glanced at him sideways. You sound like you've been through the same thing. Cal's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Let's just say I know what it's like to feel trapped. They fell silent again, each lost in their thoughts. The weight of everything they'd endured hung between them, unspoken yet palpable. Yet, amidst the pain and fear, there was also a flicker of hope, a fragile bond forged in shared suffering. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a dimly lit alleyway far from Nexora's headquarters. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and cool. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the distant hum of hovercraft engines filled the night. Cal turned to Ilara, his expression serious. You're safer now, but we can't stop here. Nexora will be looking for us everywhere. We need to get you somewhere secure. Where? she asked, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. There's a resistance base outside the city. They'll protect you. Ilara shook her head. No, I'm not hiding anymore. If you're going to fight them, I want to help. Cal frowned. Ilara, you've done enough. You don't owe anyone anything. This isn't about owing anyone, she shot back, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. This is about doing what's right. I helped build Erebus. I know how it works. If anyone can stop it, it's me. For a moment, Kale looked like he might argue. Then with a resigned sigh, he nodded. All right, but you follow my lead. No heroics. Ilara managed a weak smile. Deal. As they disappeared into the shadows, the city stretched out before them, a sprawling maze of corruption and despair. But together, they carried a spark of defiance, a promise to fight for a better future. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side. The resistance base was hidden deep within the wilderness, miles away from Neo Haven's oppressive skyline. It was a patchwork of repurposed buildings and makeshift shelters nestled in a dense forest, guarded by watchful sentries armed with scavenged weapons. To Ilara, it felt like stepping into another world, a place where hope still flickered despite the overwhelming darkness. Kale introduced her to the leaders of the rebellion, a diverse group united by their hatred for Nexora Corp. Among them was Commander Rhea Solis, a fiery woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing. She listened intently as Cal explained the situation, occasionally glancing at Ilara with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. So you're saying this device, Erebus, is almost complete? Rhea asked, leaning forward on the rickety wooden table that served as their meeting space. Ilara nodded, clutching a data tablet tightly in her hands. Yes, once activated, it will broadcast a signal capable of overriding human free will. Entire populations could be controlled remotely. And you know how to stop it? Rhea pressed. I think so, Ilara replied, her voice steady despite the weight of the question. There's a flaw in the system, an overload protocol designed to prevent catastrophic failures. If triggered manually, it would destroy Erebus without harming innocent civilians. Rhea exchanged a glance with Kel before turning back to Ilara. Triggering it manually. What does that mean? It means someone has to go inside the control hub and activate the sequence directly, Ilara explained. It's the only way to ensure the device is destroyed completely. A heavy silence fell over the room. Everyone understood the implications. This wasn't just a dangerous mission. It was likely a suicide run. Later that night, Kel found Ilara sitting alone near a campfire, staring into the flames. He approached cautiously, lowering himself onto the log beside her. For a while, neither spoke. The crackling fire and distant hum of nocturnal insects filled the void between them. You don't have to do this, Kel said finally, breaking the quiet. Ilara didn't look at him. Yes, I do. You heard me earlier. I'm the one who knows the system best. Who else can pull it off? We'll figure something out, he insisted. There has to be another way. She turned to face him then, her expression resolute but tinged with sadness. Kale, listen to me. I'd spent months working on Erebus. I helped build the thing. If anyone can exploit its weaknesses, it's me. Besides, she paused, her voice softening. This isn't just about stopping Nexora. It's about making things right. For all the people they've hurt, for everything they've taken. Cal clenched his fists, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. What about you? What happens to you after this? Do you even care? Of course I care, she snapped, her tone sharper than intended, then more gently. But sometimes doing the right thing means sacrifice. You taught me that, remember? His jaw tightened, and he looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Memories of their first meeting flooded his mind. The way she'd risked her life to save his. The promise he'd made to repay her. And now here they were again, facing another impossible choice. I won't let you die, he muttered, almost to himself. You don't get to decide that, Ilara countered firmly. This is my fight too, Kale. Let me stand beside you, not behind you. Her words struck a chord deep within him. He wanted to argue, to shield her from harm, but he knew she wouldn't back down. She was as stubborn as he was, maybe even more so. In the end, all he could do was nod reluctantly. All right, he said quietly. But we do this together, no matter what. The plan came together quickly, born of necessity rather than luxury. Ilara provided detailed schematics of Nexora's central control hub, highlighting potential entry points and security measures. Kale coordinated with the rebels to launch a diversionary attack on key Nexora facilities across the city, drawing attention away from the main target. Timing was critical. Every second counted. As the day of the operation approached, tension hung thick in the air. Soldiers double-checked their gear, strategists reviewed contingency plans, and engineers fine-tuned the equipment needed for the assault. Meanwhile, Ilara worked tirelessly, refining her approach to disabling Erebus. Sleep eluded her, but she didn't complain. There was simply too much at stake. On the eve of the mission, Kel sought her out once more. He found her in the makeshift lab, surrounded by glowing screens and scattered notes. Her face was pale, dark circles underlining her weary eyes, but her focus remained unwavering. "You should rest," he said, leaning against the doorway. "I can't," she replied without looking up. "Not yet." He stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've done enough. Trust me, you're ready." For the first time in days, she allowed herself a brief smile. "I wish I had your confidence." "You don't need it," he told her, "because I believe in you." Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, the chaos around them faded away. All that existed was the two of them, bound by shared pain, sacrifice, and an unspoken promise to see this through. The morning dawned gray and overcast, the sky heavy with clouds. Ilara and Kale suited up alongside the rebel team, strapping on lightweight armor and arming themselves with whatever weapons they could scavenge. As they boarded hovercrafts destined for Neo Haven, the mood was somber but determined. This was it, the final stand against Nexora Corp. Upon reaching the outskirts of the city, the rebels split into groups. While decoy teams launched attacks on peripheral targets, Kale and Ilara led a smaller squad toward the central control hub. The journey was fraught with danger, each step bringing them closer to certain peril. When they arrived at the facility, the entrance was heavily guarded. Kale signaled for his team to hold position while he scoped out the area. Using a stolen access card, he managed to bypass the outer defenses, granting them entry into the compound. Inside, alarms blared intermittently, and patrols roamed the corridors like predators hunting prey. "This way," Ilara whispered, guiding them through a maze of hallways based on her knowledge of the layout. They moved swiftly but cautiously, avoiding detection whenever possible. At one point, they encountered a group of enforcers rounding the corner. Kel sprang into action, his movements fluid and precise as he dispatched the guards silently. Ilara watched in awe and fear as he secured their path forward. Finally, they reached the control hub. The massive chamber loomed before them, dominated by rows of servers and a central console bathed in blue light. Beyond it stood Darius Kane, Nexora's ruthless CEO, flanked by armed bodyguards. His cold gaze swept over the intruders, lingering on Ilara. "Well, well," he sneered, "if it isn't our prodigal scientist. Back to finish what you started." Ilara stepped forward, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "I'm here to end it." Kane chuckled darkly. "End it? My dear, you misunderstand. You've already given us everything we need. Erebus is unstoppable." "No," she shot back, defiance blazing in her eyes. "It's flawed, and I'm going to prove it." With that, she lunged toward the console, fingers flying over the keys as she initiated the overload sequence. Alarms screamed louder, red lights flashing throughout the room. Kane barked orders to his guards, who opened fire. Chaos erupted as Kale and the rebels engaged the enemy, creating a diversion to buy Ilara time. Bullets ricocheted off metal surfaces, shattering glass and sparking electrical fires. Kale fought with ferocity, taking down opponents with brutal efficiency. Through it all, his eyes never strayed far from Ilara. She was the heart of this mission, the linchpin holding everything together. At last, the console emitted a high-pitched whine, signaling the activation of the overload protocol. Ilara turned to flee, but Kane intercepted her, grabbing her arm with bruising force. "You think you can undo my work?" he snarled, raising a weapon to her head. Before he could pull the trigger, Kel tackled him, sending both men crashing to the floor. They grappled fiercely, punches landing with sickening thuds. Just as Kane gained the upper hand, Ilara grabbed a fallen guard's pistol and fired a single shot, striking Kane in the shoulder. He cried out in pain, releasing his grip. "Go," Kel shouted, shoving Ilara toward the exit. They ran together, dodging falling debris as the structure began to collapse around them. Behind them, the control hub exploded in a brilliant burst of light, engulfing Erebus in flames. The shockwave knocked them off their feet, sending them sprawling onto the ground. As the dust settled, Kel scrambled to Ilara's side. She lay motionless, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead. Panic surged through him as he cradled her in his arms. "Ilara, stay with me," he pleaded, brushing hair from her face. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing dazed but conscious eyes. Did we do it? She murmured weakly. Yes, he choked out, tears streaming down his cheeks. We did it. Holding her close, Kale vowed silently to keep her safe no matter what. Together, they had struck a blow against Nexera Corp, a victory bought with courage, sacrifice, and love. The explosion lit up the night sky, a fiery beacon of hope in a world long shrouded in darkness. The destruction of Erebus echoed through Neo Haven like a thunderclap, shaking the foundations of Nexera Corp's iron grip on the city. For the first time in years, people dared to step outside their homes, drawn by the distant glow and the faint possibility that freedom might finally be within reach. Kale held Ilara tightly as they stumbled away from the crumbling control hub, his heart pounding with equal parts relief and dread. She was alive, but barely. Her body trembled under the strain of exhaustion, blood seeping from wounds both visible and hidden. Every step felt like a battle, every breath an act of defiance against the odds stacked against them. Just a little farther, Cal urged, his voice hoarse but unwavering. We're almost there. Ilara didn't respond, her head resting limply against his chest. Her eyes fluttered open occasionally, clouded with pain but still carrying a spark of determination. He knew she wouldn't give up, not now, not after everything they'd fought for. Still, guilt gnawed at him. If only he'd been faster, stronger. If only he could have protected her better. Behind them, the remnants of Nexera's forces scrambled to contain the chaos. Flames engulfed the central facility, sending plumes of smoke spiraling into the heavens. Enforcers shouted orders, their voices drowned out by the roar of collapsing structures and the wail of emergency sirens. It was clear that Nexera Corp's reign of terror had suffered a devastating blow, but the fight was far from over. When they finally reached the rendezvous point, a secluded clearing on the outskirts of the city, the rebels were waiting. Medical teams rushed forward, pulling Ilara gently from Kale's arms and laying her on a makeshift stretcher. Kale resisted letting go, his fingers lingering on hers until the last possible moment. She needs help, one of the medics said urgently, already working to stabilize her condition. Get her to the infirmary immediately. As they carried her away, Kale sank to his knees, overwhelmed by a torrent of emotions. Relief warred with grief, pride mingled with regret. Around him, the rebels cheered, celebrating their hard-won victory. But Cal couldn't bring himself to join in. All he could think about was Ilara, the woman who had saved him once and whom he had sworn to protect. Commander Rhea approached cautiously, placing a hand on his shoulder. You did good, Cal. We all did. Erebus is gone. But what cost? He muttered, his voice raw with emotion. She shouldn't have had to go through that. Rhea sighed, her expression softening. She chose this path, just like you did. You can't carry the weight of everyone's choices on your shoulders. I should have done more, he insisted, shaking its head. I promised I'd save her. And you did, Rhea countered firmly. She's alive because of you. Don't forget that. Her words struck a chord, but Cal couldn't shake the feeling that he'd failed somehow. He watched silently as the medics loaded Ilara onto a transport vehicle bound for the resistance base. Then, steeling himself, he climbed aboard, refusing to leave her side even for a moment. Days passed in a blur of medical care and recovery. Ilara's injuries were severe, but her resilience proved stronger than anyone expected. Slowly, she began to heal, physically at least. Emotionally, however, the scars ran deeper. She rarely spoke, retreating into herself as though shielding her thoughts from prying eyes. Cale stayed by her bedside whenever he could, offering quiet support and companionship. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ilara finally broke her silence. Do you think we made a difference? She asked softly, staring out the window. Cale hesitated before answering. Yes, Nexera's power is broken, for now. People are starting to rise up. They know they don't have to live in fear anymore. Ilara nodded slowly, her gaze distant. It doesn't feel like enough. It never does, Cale admitted. But it's a start, and we'll keep fighting, together. She turned to look at him then, her eyes searching his face. Why do you keep risking everything for me? Because you risked everything for me first, he replied without hesitation. And because, he trailed off, his voice catching slightly. Because I care about you, Ilara. More than I ever thought possible. Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow. A small, fragile smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Thank you, she whispered, for coming back. I'll always come back. Kale promised, taking her hand in his. No matter what. In the weeks that followed, the resistance worked tirelessly to rebuild what Mexera had destroyed. Communities came together, sharing resources and rebuilding neighborhoods torn apart by years of oppression. Protests erupted across the city, demanding justice and accountability for Nexera's crimes. The corporation, once untouchable, found itself fractured and vulnerable. At the heart of it all stood Ilara and Kale, two unlikely heroes united by love, sacrifice, and an unyielding belief in a better future. Though neither knew what lay ahead, they faced it side by side, drawing strength from each other and the knowledge that their actions had sparked a revolution. One quiet morning, as they walked hand in hand through the newly restored streets of Neo Haven, Ilara paused to watch children playing in a park. Laughter filled the air, a sound she hadn't heard in years. Turning to Kale, she smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. "We did it," she said simply. "We're not done yet," Kale replied, squeezing her hand. "But we will be someday, together." And with that, they continued onward, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so bleak. Hope had returned to Neo Haven, and with it, the promise of a brighter tomorrow.